Hi, my name is Brianna and welcome to History Now. This is my co-host Haley.
Today we are introducing the Cuban Missile Crisis, a very suspenseful and dangerous time for the U.S.
We will each guide you through the key events and points of the Cuban Missile Crisis as we move through the news report.
We will discuss who was involved, what happened, why the events took place, and much more.
Now we're going to be talking about who was involved and what happened when these events took place. Let's get started with the first set of news. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation between the Soviet Union and the U.S. about the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis began October 16, 1962, when Kennedy was informed of the missile buildup in Cuba from spies. Kennedy saw this as a threat to the U.S. because Cuba is only 90 miles away. Because of this, Kennedy needed to take careful action. He came up with an idea of a blockade to stop any other weapons from entering Cuba. Once he announced his blockade plan, Kennedy received a letter from Khrushchev saying they wouldn't observe the blockade and deny the presence of nuclear missiles.
Hello, it's Haley. I'm going to guide you through the next 6 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. To pick up where we left off, Kennedy had just received a letter from Khrushchev regarding the blockade. However, this letter had no effect on Kennedy besides being annoyed that Khrushchev had not admitted to the presence of the missiles. Kennedy continued on with the blockade. The Soviets arrived at the blockade, but not much after they turned their ships around. Although they turned around, it was not the last of the Soviet Union. Photos showed that missile bases in Cuba were rapidly progressing. 2 days after the blockade, Khrushchev sent another letter to Kennedy. He claimed that the missiles were purely defensive, but proposed if the U.S. would not attack Cuba and lift the blockade, then they would consider the removal of the missiles. But Khrushchev revised his proposals in another letter he sent stating that the removal of the missiles in Cuba would cost the removal of the U.S. missiles in Turkey. With this proposal, Kennedy had some thinking to do. Find out how it all ended with Sahara coming up next.
Thank you, Haley. Now, continuing on with the segment. Kennedy had been left with a very important decision to make. But once again, Kennedy decided to ignore his letter. On October 27, 1962, not longer after receiving Khrushchev's letter, Kennedy was informed of an American U-2 plane that was shot down. We were informed that this plane was spying on the Soviets trying to gather information. The overall event, however, upset the president gravely. He was used by other officials to immediately launch an attack on Cuba, jeopardizing a nuclear war with the Soviet Union and Cuba. Kennedy decided on delaying the attack and accepting the terms that Khrushchev had suggested in his first letter. The next day, in reply to Kennedy, Khrushchev sent a letter informing that in order to eliminate conflict immediately, they would create and return the missiles back from Cuba back to the Soviet Union. This was the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now we will review with Angelina and explain why it all happened.
Thank you, Sarah. And now to help you better understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an overall result of the U.S. and the Soviet Union thirst for power and superiority. They had long been fighting to be at the top, especially after World War II, when tensions increased and dramatically started what was known as the Cold War. Any alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union immediately stopped when World War II ended. The U.S. had always been a little ahead of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union made a breakthrough in the space race by sending the first man into space. The Soviet Union sought to do greater, though, and gain an advantage on the U.S. with their own creation of the nuclear missile, which the U.S. had not much earlier developed. Although the Soviets had discovered how to create their own nuclear missiles, the U.S. still had to gain on how many nuclear missiles they had. This was not good in the view of the Soviets. They wanted to have a greater position on the U.S. This is when and why Khrushchev placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. He sought to enhance his power and did just so in a sense. The U.S., however, was not just going to sit around for this, and therefore the Cuban Missile Crisis made its mark in the history of the U.S. The U.S. overall reacted calmly and saw the crisis as though they had won. They had addressed the problem and had achieved the removal of the very missiles that had threatened them. The Soviet Union had acted with the thought of the crisis being in their favor. Khrushchev had a sense of confidence whenever he spoke in his letters to Kennedy. The Cuban Missile Crisis did, in fact, end in their favor somewhat. The missiles from Turkey had been moved, which had previously posed a threat to them. The missiles in Turkey were in fact U.S. missiles, which greatly helped the Soviet Union with the removal of them. The removal of the missiles in Turkey was a secret to the rest of the world, so they saw Khrushchev as no hero and eventually replaced him with a new leader. In the eyes of Kennedy and Khrushchev, they had reacted as though they had won. Now to Brianna with the effects of the crisis.
Now that we covered how both sides reacted, I will now explain what the long-term effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis were. There were several long-term effects included. For example, the leaders of the Soviet Union were sure they would never be pushed around by the United States again. Another long-term effect includes the Soviet Union setting up telephone links so direct communications could take place in the future between Washington and Moscow. Also, the Test Ban Treaty was signed to ban testing nuclear weapons between the United States, USSR, and Britain.
Thanks, Brianna. Good afternoon. I'll be discussing whether the Cuban Missile Crisis was a positive or negative effect. The Cuban Missile Crisis had both positive and negative effects. It could have ended very wrong or caused a nuclear war to break out. Both America and Cuba had nuclear power, and since they were so close, they could have ended each other's nations. Cuba made America feel extremely threatened on many different levels. American allies would also be made to question the American commitment to their defenses. On the positive side, they found a way out of the crisis without starting a war. It made both the Soviet and US think about the possibility of destruction between the human civilizations, rather than nuclear war just because of the differences between the two countries. They made sure the Cubans would not receive nuclear weapons from the Soviet, putting the US out of harm's way. America also managed a significant diplomatic win against the Soviet Union. They assured that Cuba would not receive weapons from the Soviet. They guaranteed the stability in the Caribbean area and did whatever was possible to avoid a nuclear war.
Thanks, Haley. Last but not least, I will be talking about the kind of impact the Cuban Missile Crisis had on the U.S. and the Soviet relations. The U.S. and the Soviet Union almost completely comprised for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a key turning point in the Cold War, from hostility to fear for both countries. Both sides built up the nuclear arsenal and had enough weapons to destroy the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 marked a high watermark in the sphere of nuclear destruction. The main impact of this crisis was that both sides decided to take a step back from the harmful rhetoric and take attempts to find common ground. Nuclear destruction would not be beneficial to each side, so efforts were made to prevent this scenario. The countries stopped confronting each other directly. This crisis seemed to benefit the United States from public relations standpoint because Kennedy was seen as not backing down from communism and the Soviet Union. The Khrushchev's image was a factor that led to the removal of the Russian premier in 1964. The leader that followed were more open to negotiating with the United States in terms of nuclear treaties. In 1968, an international treaty called the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in the spirit of preventing a nuclear war that was made possible by the Cuban Missile Crisis. This attempted to stop the spread of nuclear weapons to countries that did not already have them. It was an important step of a disarmament process and would have probably not have been possible without the standoff between Kennedy and Khrushchev in October in 1962.
Our presentation about the Cuban Missile Crisis is sadly coming to an end.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very impactful event in U.S. history, and we're happy that we were able to inform you about it.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to our report and allowing us to guide you through all the important events that took place.